3 infants were born on the same night in Henrico County, Virginia, in April of 1802. 3 identical cries rose into the dark of a plantation house, sharp and new against the heavy silence. Yet only 2 of those children would be claimed by their mother. The third, darker than his brothers by no more than what some witnesses later described as the shade of a long summer, vanished from the family's record within hours of entering the world. What unfolded inside that upstairs bedroom was never investigated. It was not written into court dockets or church registries. Instead, it survived in fragments, in private correspondence, in plantation ledgers that spoke only in numbers, and in the careful, fearful recollections of enslaved women who understood what that difference in skin might mean. For more than 2 centuries, the truth remained buried. Tonight, we return to that night and begin to uncover what happened when Margaret Fairmont gave birth to triplets and made a choice that would quietly ruin every life it touched. Before we step fully into that past, pause with me for a moment. Stories like this do not surface easily. They live in dust and silence, passed over because they unsettle the comforting versions of history. If you're listening now, you're part of a small group willing to confront them. Stay with me. And as we continue, remember where you're listening from, because these stories belong to places as much as they belong to people. Now let us go back to Virginia in 1802, to a world where appearance was survival and where one woman's fear would decide the fate of her own child. The spring of that year arrived gently along the James River. Tobacco plantations stretched across the rolling hills of Henrico County, their fields already marked for another season of profit and exhaustion. Among them stood Fairmont Plantation, nearly 800 acres of fertile river-bottom land. Its wealth rested on the labor of 43 enslaved people and on a family name carefully cultivated over 3 generations. The main house rose on a low hill, brick and white columns visible from the river road, an architectural announcement of order and prosperity. Margaret Fairmont had come to that house 6 years earlier, a bride of 17, leaving behind her family's smaller Williamsburg estate. She was the youngest daughter of the Sutherland family, a lineage that liked to remind anyone listening of its English roots. Her marriage to Thomas Fairmont had been praised as ideal. Old money joined to established land, youth paired with authority. Thomas was 15 years older than his wife, a man shaped by inheritance and obligation. He managed the plantation with careful attention, believing discipline and distance were the foundations of success. But by 1802, that image had begun to fracture. Margaret had lost 2 pregnancies in the first years of their marriage. The first was quietly mourned. The second left her withdrawn through an entire winter, rarely leaving her bed. During that time, Thomas grew increasingly absent, finding reasons to ride to Richmond, to inspect fields, to be anywhere but inside the silence of his own home. The pressure for an heir settled heavily on Margaret. Her mother's letters arrived weekly, each one a reminder, subtle or not, of cousins producing children, of neighbors expanding families, of a wife's duty to secure her husband's future. When Margaret conceived again in the summer of 1801, the household seemed to breathe again. Thomas returned his attention. Her mother visited and pronounced the pregnancy blessed. The enslaved women prepared the nursery with unusual care, sensing that this birth carried more weight than most. What none of them expected was that Margaret carried not 1 child, but 3. The realization came late. In February, Dr. Edmund Yancey, the physician who attended the county's wealthiest families, noted unusual movement during an examination. By March, he was certain. Twins, possibly triplets. The news sent Margaret into a state that shifted between joy and dread. Thomas accepted it with quiet satisfaction, already imagining abundance where he had once feared lack. Margaret, however, carried a private terror. She had reason to fear what her children might reveal. Among the enslaved workers at Fairmont was a woman named Esther. Born on the property 28 years earlier, she worked in the main house, trained by Thomas's mother before her death. Esther moved through rooms almost unseen, efficient, precise, expected to appear only when needed. She had given birth twice herself. Neither child lived long enough to be named in any meaningful way. During Margaret's pregnancy, Esther became indispensable. Margaret insisted she be present each morning, during examinations, even at night. A small servant's room beside the master bedroom was prepared for her. Thomas found it odd but did not object. A pregnant woman's anxieties were to be indulged. What Thomas did not know, what Margaret prayed he would never discover, was that his absence the previous summer had not passed without consequence. In July of 1801, Thomas traveled to Williamsburg for 3 weeks to settle family matters. Margaret remained behind, claiming the heat made travel impossible. During those weeks, the plantation grew quieter. Margaret walked the grounds early in the morning, took tea on the back veranda, watched the distant figures working the fields. 19 enslaved men labored at Fairmont that summer. Among them was William, a carpenter purchased 3 years earlier from Maryland. He was skilled, quiet, and noticeably lighter-skinned than most. His parentage recorded in sale documents, but never discussed aloud. What passed between Margaret and William was never written down. No letter survives. No confession exists. But 9 months later, on the night of April the 23rd, Margaret knew there was a chance. Small, perhaps, but real, that her children might expose a truth she could not survive. Labor began just after sunset. The household fell into practiced chaos. Thomas sent for Dr. Yancey, knowing it would be hours before he arrived. Esther and another enslaved woman, Ruth, were summoned to the bedroom. Downstairs, Thomas paced and drank brandy, waiting. Margaret's fear bordered on hysteria. She gripped Esther's hand, whispering between contractions, words Ruth could not understand. Esther did. "You have to help me," Margaret gasped. "Whatever happens, promise me." Esther nodded. The first child arrived just before midnight. A healthy boy, loud and strong. Thomas was called upstairs, his relief visible. He stayed only briefly. The second child came an hour later, another boy, slightly smaller but vigorous. Thomas returned, astonished now by his fortune. Dr. Yancey arrived as the second child was born. "There may be a third," he said. The third child was born at 2:17 in the morning. For a moment, the room went silent. The infant was darker than his brothers. Not dramatically, but unmistakably so. Where the others were pale, he carried a warm brown tone that would deepen with time. Margaret saw him and made a sound that was almost animal. Esther moved quickly, taking the child from Ruth's hands. She spoke with authority, sending Ruth for linens, directing the doctor to prepare a tonic. In the confusion, she met Margaret's eyes. An understanding passed between them. "The child is weak," Esther said aloud, "breathing poorly." The baby cried, strong and alive, but Esther held him close, muffling the sound. Dr. Yancey nodded. "Common with triplets," he muttered. Thomas was never called to see the third child. Instead, he was told the baby would not survive the night. He accepted it with tired relief. 2 sons were enough. Triplets invited questions. By morning, the house had settled. Only Esther remained in the room, holding the child. "What will you do?" Margaret whispered. "What you asked," Esther replied. She left before dawn, moving through the plantation she knew by heart. She passed cabins, barns, sheds, until she reached the old dairy house. Inside, she stood in the dark, holding a sleeping infant, understanding what was expected of her. She could have ended it there. Many did. But she did not. Instead, Esther walked on into the quarters, to the cabin of an old woman named Danina, too old to work, too stubborn to disappear. "You have something that needs hiding," Danina said, opening the door. Esther placed the child in her arms. "He needs to live," Esther said. Danina looked down at the infant, then back up. After a long moment, she nodded. "What's his name?" she asked. Esther hesitated, then chose one: Samuel. And in that quiet exchange, a life meant to be erased was given a name and a chance. Samuel's first years passed in a state of careful invisibility. Danina raised him inside the narrow boundaries of her cabin, bringing him out only when the light was low and the plantation's attention was elsewhere. She told anyone who asked that he was her grandson, sent back from North Carolina after his mother died in childbirth. It was a story simple enough to survive casual scrutiny, and more importantly, it was a story Thomas Fairmont never bothered to question. Esther came often. She brought scraps of cloth, bits of food, small necessities she could spare without drawing notice. She watched Samuel learn to sit, then crawl, then walk on unsteady legs across the dirt floor. She heard his first words. She saw his face take shape, and with each passing month, the resemblance to the Fairmont twins grew more pronounced. The curve of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, the way his hair lay against his scalp. These were not coincidences. They were inheritances. In the main house, Thomas Jr. and Henry were celebrated. A wet nurse was hired, then a nursery maid. On their first birthday, Thomas commissioned a portrait. The twins seated side by side in white gowns, pale and perfect, their likeness captured in oil and hung in the parlor as proof of continuity and success. Margaret passed that portrait every day, and every day she felt the absence of the third face that should have been there. Her relationship with Esther shifted into something tense and fragile. They shared a secret that could not be spoken, a knowledge that altered every glance. Margaret avoided Esther's eyes. Esther performed her duties with a distance that bordered on cold, as if emotional withdrawal were the only way to endure what she had done and what she continued to protect. Thomas noticed nothing. His sons were healthy. His wife had recovered. His crops were strong. Life, as far as he was concerned, was proceeding correctly. But among the enslaved community, truth moved quietly. People noticed the extra rations Danina received. They noticed Esther's attention to the child. They noticed how Samuel's features mirrored those of the master's sons. Most understood that silence was survival, but not everyone viewed the knowledge as a burden. One man did the arithmetic and waited. Jacob was an enslaved field overseer, placed in an uneasy position of authority over others who shared his bondage. He wanted favor, advancement, a future shaped by usefulness rather than invisibility, and so he watched. He observed Esther's visits. He noted Samuel's face. He waited until the resemblance could no longer be dismissed as imagination. In the spring of 1804, when Samuel was 2 years old, Jacob approached Thomas as he inspected a newly planted field. "Sir," Jacob said carefully, "there's something you ought to see." Thomas bristled at the interruption. "Make it quick." "It concerns the children, sir." That was enough. Thomas listened. Jacob did not accuse outright. He suggested, he implied. He asked Thomas to look for himself. They went to Danina's cabin. Samuel sat in the dirt, playing with a carved toy. When he looked up, Thomas felt something inside him falter. The child's face was unmistakable. It was his own, reflected back at him in miniature. Danina's story unraveled under questioning. Dates betrayed her. Thomas's certainty fractured into rage and disbelief. He returned to the main house at a near run. Margaret was embroidering when he burst into the room. "Tell me about the third child," he said. She tried to lie. It failed. The truth emerged in fragments. William, the summer, the fear, the decision. Margaret spoke of shame and survival, of terror at what would happen if the child were seen. "You gave away my son," Thomas said. Whatever else the child represented, Thomas understood one thing with brutal clarity. The boy was his. Property, lineage, flesh of his flesh. Margaret had seen evidence of betrayal. Thomas saw ownership. Esther was summoned. She did not deny what she had done. She corrected the language. "She asked me to hide him," Esther said. "So I did." Thomas considered punishment. He considered violence. But Esther held something dangerous, knowledge that could dismantle his carefully ordered world. And so a compromise was made. Samuel would remain in the quarters, Danina's grandson in name only. He would not approach the main house. He would not be acknowledged. And if the secret escaped, the consequences would be severe. For a time, the arrangement held, but plantations were never sealed systems. Visitors came, neighbors observed, and curiosity, once stirred, did not rest. In 1805, Margaret's sister Charlotte visited from Williamsburg. She walked the grounds with practiced scrutiny and found Samuel at Danina's cabin. She saw at once what others had learned to ignore. The confrontation between the sisters was sharp and merciless. Charlotte saw scandal. Margaret saw collapse. When Thomas returned, Charlotte pressed for a solution. The child must go. Thomas resisted, not out of mercy, but out of possession. He did not kill what was his. But practicality, once planted, grows. Rumors began to circulate beyond Fairmont. Whispers followed Thomas into drawing rooms and business meetings. Invitations thinned. Respect cooled. By 1806, Thomas understood the truth he had been avoiding. Samuel could not remain. He ordered Danina to prepare the child for removal to Richmond. She listened without protest, then returned to her cabin and made a different choice. That night, she went to Esther. "They're taking him," Danina said. "I won't let it happen." Running was dangerous, often fatal, but it was also the only refusal the system could not fully control. Esther shared what she knew: routes, names, rumors of refuge. They planned in whispers, aware that failure would be punished brutally. On the third night, Danina left with Samuel. They did not get far. Dogs found them by morning. The return to Fairmont was slow and humiliating. Samuel was torn from Danina's arms. Thomas ordered punishment without hesitation. 20 lashes, confinement, survival, but barely. Esther took Samuel away from the barn before the sounds began. She held him, shielding his ears, knowing he would never forget the fear in the air that morning. After that, the fiction collapsed. Samuel was too visible, too dangerous, too bound to scandal. Thomas searched for an answer that did not exist until Charlotte provided one. A missionary family heading west. Children taken without questions. Distance so vast it promised erasure. The Hayes family arrived in September. They were earnest, kind, unaware of what they were carrying away. Samuel left Fairmont in a wagon, small and confused, his name intact, but his history stripped from him. Esther watched him go. Margaret watched from behind glass. Thomas told himself it was mercy. In the quarters, Danina learned Samuel was gone and retreated into silence. She lived 2 more years, present only in body. Esther remained. She began to write. And with that act, she refused to let the story disappear completely. Years passed after Samuel's departure, but the quiet he left behind was not peace. It was a hollowing. At Fairmont, life continued in the way it always had. Meals taken at the proper hours, fields worked and harvested, accounts tallied. But something essential had gone missing, and everyone felt it, though no one spoke its name. Margaret never recovered. Whatever strength she had once summoned to survive her decision drained away with Samuel's absence. She withdrew into the upper rooms of the house, avoiding company, declining visits, letting letters go unanswered. When she did appear, she carried herself like someone already half removed from the world. Physicians offered tonics and rest. None of it touched the deeper sickness. She had preserved her reputation, but in doing so, she had severed something inside herself that could not be repaired. Thomas responded differently. He buried himself in work with an almost desperate intensity, riding to Richmond more often, investing in new ventures, chasing the reassurance of numbers and contracts. He spoke less at home. When he did speak, it was clipped, practical, drained of warmth. He watched his legitimate sons grow and felt pride curdle into something uneasy. Their faces reminded him of another face, one he had chosen to erase rather than confront. Thomas Jr. and Henry sensed it. Children always do. They grew up in a house heavy with unspoken things, aware that something was wrong but never told what. When they were old enough, they left for schooling in Richmond and did not look back. Fairmont was not a place either of them wished to inherit in spirit, even if they might one day inherit it in law. The plantation itself began to falter. Thomas made poor decisions, invested in failing enterprises, borrowed against land he once believed untouchable. Portions of Fairmont were sold off to satisfy debts. By the time the War of 1812 ended, the estate was a shadow of its former size. The illusion of permanence had collapsed, slowly and quietly, the way such things always do. Esther remained through it all. She continued to serve, to move through rooms as she always had, efficient and reserved. But at night, in the privacy of her cabin, she wrote. She recorded the night of the birth, the third child's face, the whispered orders, the choice she made. She wrote about Danina's courage and punishment, about Samuel's small hands clutching at her clothes. She hid the pages beneath a loose floorboard, not knowing who might one day find them, only knowing they needed to exist. Margaret died in 1827 at 42. The doctor called it a wasting sickness. Those who had watched her fade understood it differently. She was buried in the family cemetery, not far from the small, unmarked grave that was said to hold her third child, a grave that had never contained a body at all. Thomas lived 7 years longer. His death in 1834 was marked by a brief notice in a Richmond paper, listing his public service and plantation holdings. There was no mention of scandal, no hint of what had been hidden. His estate, diminished and burdened with debt, was divided between his sons. Neither wanted Fairmont. It was sold, broken apart, its lands parceled out to strangers. Time did what time always does. The plantation house survived, repurposed, its history simplified into dates and architectural notes. Guides spoke of tobacco, of colonial prosperity, of prominent families. They did not speak of a third child born in the night and carried away before dawn. For decades, the truth slept beneath Esther's floorboard. It surfaced in 1889, long after Esther herself was gone, discovered among her belongings by a descendant who did not know what to do with it. The journal was dangerous. It named names. It described acts polite society preferred to forget. A lawyer advised discretion. The pages were donated to the Virginia Historical Society with a stipulation that they remain sealed for 50 years. They waited in an archive, cataloged and ignored, until 1952, when a graduate student researching plantation life came across them and recognized their significance. Margaret Fairmont's third child emerged from obscurity, not as rumor, but as documented truth. Historians tried to trace Samuel's fate. Records from Ohio missions were incomplete. The Hayes family could be followed west, establishing a small church near what would become Cincinnati. After 1810, the trail faded. Children died frequently on the frontier. Names changed. Lives dissolved into census lines and unmarked graves. There was one possibility. In the 1850 census, a man named Samuel Hayes appeared, 48 years old, listed as a schoolteacher in a small Ohio town. The age fit. The name fit. Nothing else could be proven. Perhaps Samuel lived. Perhaps he learned, taught, married, aged. Perhaps he built a life beyond the plantation system that had rejected him at birth. Or perhaps he died young, another child claimed by disease or hardship, his existence barely noted even by those who loved him. We cannot know, and that uncertainty is part of the story. What we do know is this. On April 23, 1802, 3 children were born at Fairmont Plantation in Henrico County, Virginia. 2 were claimed, named, raised as heirs. 1 was hidden, renamed by necessity, sent away, and erased from official memory. The question that lingers is not only what became of Samuel, it is how many others like him never left a trace at all. How many children were quietly removed to protect reputations? How many lives were deemed inconvenient? How many secrets were pressed into the earth beneath unmarked stones or hidden beneath floorboards, waiting for someone brave enough or distant enough to look? This is not a story of ghosts or curses. Its horror is quieter and far more familiar. It is the horror of fear, fear of exposure, fear of consequence, fear of losing status in a world built on rigid lines and brutal contradictions. It is the horror of people choosing preservation over compassion, silence over truth. Margaret Fairmont's story is unsettling not because it is rare, but because it likely was not. The details are particular, but the structure was common. Plantations were places of intimacy and violence, of proximity without equality, of children born into contradictions their parents refused to face. Samuel mattered less than appearances. His life was weighed against reputation and found expendable. And yet, because one woman chose to write instead of forget, his existence did not vanish entirely. It surfaced, fragile but undeniable, a reminder that history is full of lives that were meant to disappear, and that sometimes, despite everything, they refuse to stay buried. The past is not done with us. It waits, patient and quiet, for someone to listen.